Welcome to today's Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Thank you for joining us today. Every organization I know has been working overtime to bring us information about October 7th and Israel's subsequent war against Hamas. We're doing it as well. But it's our general thought that weekly programs are better at providing context rather than trying to provide you with battlefield updates. Today's context is Iran's ballistic missile program and how it changed the region and how it threatens Israeli and American security interests. Our guest is Behnam Ben Taliblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Before we get to Behnam, you get your JPC commercial. The Jewish Policy Center was founded in 1985 as a nonprofit organization, providing analysis and commentary on foreign and domestic subjects by scholars, academics, and commentators. We support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. Right now, however, our most important job is to support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them, and now more than ever to support the Israeli government and the IDF in their efforts to defend the people of Israel and bring the perpetrators of the massacres, hostage-taking, and rocket barrages to justice. In our spare time, as an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our Insight articles. We have a lot of guest articles right now. Insight is worth checking out, even more than it normally is. And you will see our magazine In Focus Quarterly. You can also find our previous webinar programs. And if you want closer to real-time information, follow us on X, formerly Twitter. We are at the JPC. We have a lot of breaking material there from Israel and from elsewhere at the JPC. And now our guest. I'm really pleased today to bring Behnam Ben Taliblu, a senior fellow at FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, to our program. He focuses there at FDD on Iranian security and political issues. He previously served there as a research fellow and a senior Iran analyst. Before that, he worked on nonproliferation issues. Behnam has both subject matter expertise and native Farsi skills, which he uses to track a wide range of Iran-related topics, including nuclear nonproliferation or nuclear proliferation, as it may be, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the IRGC, Iran's foreign and security policy, and internal Iranian politics. Frequently called on to brief journalists, congressional staff, and other Washington audiences, Behnam has testified before Congress and the Canadian Parliament. His work has been cited by the mainstream print and media broadcasts in the US and Europe. You know, sometimes they have to get really good expert people with real credentials, then they turn to Behnam, then they go back to doing what else they do. But most important from our point of view right now, he is the author of a recent monograph called Arsenal, not the football team, Arsenal, Assessing the Islamic Republic of Iran's Ballistic Missile Program. We're going to start there. Behnam, first of all, what is the most important thing we need to know about the ballistic missile program? And secondly, how much trouble are we in? The floor is yours.
Shoshana, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you and the distinguished virtual audience again. And thank you for the very kind intro and mentioning that monograph, which was a 3-year labor of love for me here in my decade plus at FDD, tracking every single missile, every single test, every single transfer, every single battlefield use, just to make sure the general public has this material out there in the open source. Because unfortunately, the barrier to the use of this tool, whether it means the proliferation of them to the proxies that the Islamic Republic calls the axis of resistance, and you see similar tools being used by Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, as well as, of course, the Houthis in Yemen, who have some of the longest range strike stuff, and people did not even think this would be possible a few years ago. As well as, of course, the Islamic Republic's own willingness and own boldness, some could say, to strike overtly from its own territory, not work through proxies, and launch these missiles at targets in places like Iraq and Syria, that are not just affiliated with the ISIS presence, but also with the US force presence. And with this evolving capability behind Iran's ballistic missiles, which perhaps the most important takeaway for this audience right now, we can say the bottom line up front, is that Iran has the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, larger than US partner Israel, larger than NATO's Turkey, larger than Saudi Arabia. Sometimes one might say this is by design, because the old fault lines in the Middle East were that the good guys, for lack of a better word, had jets, and the bad guys, for lack of a better word, had missiles. There's been a newfound interest both by US allies and US adversaries in developing missiles or procuring missiles. But the Islamic Republic, unfortunately, remains well ahead of this array of US partners and allies in the region with its own ballistic missile arsenal. The Islamic Republic also has cruise missiles. The Islamic Republic also has drones. It has rockets. And when you connect this whole series of unmanned aerial threats, you see a mastery of this whole spectrum, from on the low end, mortars and rockets, on the mid-tier, drones, then cruise missiles, then ballistic missiles. You see a real mastery in the unmanned aerial space, a mastery that 2 decades ago, or even a decade ago, some would think would be irrelevant, some would think would be hyperbole, some would think would not yield Iran a conventional battlefield military capability. And for a very long time, and we saw this maybe a decade and a half ago in the talks that ultimately led up to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, we saw a dismissing of the battlefield utility, of the conventional military utility of Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. And we only, and by we I mean former administration officials, from, you could say 2006 all the way until 2015-16 even, primarily saw this threat as a nuclear threat, as ballistic missiles being a delivery vehicle only for a nuclear weapon or potentially even a chemical weapon. But you see them used on the conventional war zones and the conventional battlefields and the asymmetric battlefields across the Middle East today. And not every proxy has every single missile Iran has, but Iran also is developing new capabilities specifically for different proxies in different theaters. We see something that we never thought we would see before, which is reverse proliferation. The Iranians developing systems for proxies, getting battlefield uses out of it, and then reincorporating it back into its own arsenal under a different name. So there is a quantity argument here. There is a quality argument here. Both of these things are on the rise. There is a real concern as to what options the U.S. has against it, given how far this threat has advanced. There is really even more outsized questions as to what do our regional partners have as tools or offsets against these capabilities. And then more importantly, what are we going to do as the regime, the men who wield these weapons, as the regime feels more emboldened, as the barriers, the political and the technical barriers to the use of these systems drop, and the capabilities continue to grow. Capabilities defined as lethality, range, force employment, survivability, mobility. And in the monograph, I try to document the origin, the evolution, and the future of this program. And those last few areas I mentioned about survivability and mobility and range, those are really the future of this program. In the past decade, they've shown you that they can move towards developing a precision strike capability. They've added quality to the quantity that they already possess. And these are some of the likeliest areas that they're going to be moving into in the future. And it has real world effects because one might separate out that, okay, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza does not have the ballistic missile capabilities of the Islamic Republic. One might separate out that the Houthis in Yemen have medium range ballistic missiles. And in Iraq and in Lebanon, there are only short range ballistic missiles present. One might try to separate out this mosaic of unmanned aerial threats that exist in the region. But there is a common thread through them. And that common thread is that Iran routinely, materially, financially supports these groups towards the same end, towards fighting the US, towards fighting Israel, towards changing the battlefields of the Middle East and making it more hospitable for the venomous ideology that regime has been exporting for 4+ decades. And ultimately, these weapons redound to the confidence of the Islamic Republic. the more capable these systems, the more confident the Islamic Republic. So if one only thought that Iran would act out if it had a nuclear weapon, meaning if it had a nuclear weapon and it would, support terrorism more and support regional destabilization more, that's not only the case. With Iran's robust conventional missile arsenal and the evolving missile arsenal and rocket arsenal and drone arsenal of its proxies, it also has that confidence boon. And you see precisely why and how they're able to act on that confidence boon across the battlefields in the Middle East today. So this is leading to some game-changing, taboo-breaking, sacred cow slaughtering phenomenon in the region, where there is already a multi-front war underway from the Islamic Republic against Israel, we should say, and against select U.S. Force presence in the region. And the regime feels confident that there will not be a response against it overtly, directly, attributably, because this arsenal, it believes, has, for lack of a better word, deterred America, deterred Israel, deterred the Arab world. And that confidence and that deterrence boon is only growing as these capabilities grow.
So this raises the question, have we been sidetracked by the nuclear issue? I have written many times in the past that while you were doing this, America over here, Iran was doing that over there. Is the US government sidetracked by its concern about nuclear weapons and failed to pay attention to these things?
I would certainly be inclined to agree with you. I think a charitable response from the US government is that they would say, oh, well, we prioritize the nuclear threat above the rest of the other threats, or because the nuclear threat, if it's actualized, would be so extreme, it's worth, sacrificing all of these other matters, the regional matter, the drone matter, the human rights matter, the terrorism matter, as you saw, most unfortunately, they did with the conversations surrounding what does the Iran threat look like 2015 to present, or what does the Iran threat look like with nuclear deal in hand, with fatally flawed JCPOA in hand, 2015 to present. And in essence, if you're going to deal with the Iran threat, and I think you and I see this issue the same way, you have to be intellectually coherent and intellectually consistent about it. You can't have a legal and a political architecture that rightly calls the Islamic Republic a state sponsor of terrorism and the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, and have some form of coercive, punitive economic measure, basically sanctions, a fancy way to say sanctions and designations against it on the one hand for 4+ decades, admittedly at different levels of intensity. And then on the other hand, say that you aren't concerned about terrorism and that if any financial capabilities or any other material capabilities that the regime gets while you're in pursuit of this nuclear quest will not go to fund terrorism, will not go to make its conventional arsenal more robust, will not allow Iran to move more cleanly into the bosom of America's great power partners like Russia and China. So I strongly agree with you. I think once you tell the Iranians that this is our priority, they understand that you are willing to sacrifice everything on the altar of that priority. And now, many years later, the Islamic Republic is essentially on the cusp of being a threshold nuclear state. So the prioritization of that threat above all the others has not even yielded the security dividend. And it's not just because there is no JCPOA nuclear deal today. It is actually because so many technical barriers have been broken on the Iran nuclear file. The fact that the regime flirted earlier this year with 83%, almost 84% enrichment of uranium, which is a stone's throw from 90%, which is weapons grade. I just want to remind the audience, yes, unfortunately, the US is the only country to use nuclear weapons at a time of war, but the uranium levels that we had enriched in the bombing of Japan at the end of World War II, the US had reportedly only enriched to 80% purity. So again, this artificial standard of waiting for Iran to go to 90, when the regime has gone to 84% today, when the only nuclear use using uranium in history in a battlefield was with 80% purity, shows you how far this regime has gone and how unconstrained it has been, even by the United States, whose stated goal and whose intent is to sacrifice everything on this one altar is it just shows you how I want to say, with immense respect to policymakers on both sides of the aisle, how much of a shortcoming there has been. It doesn't mean that there has not been valiant attempts. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been tons of covert things. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been attempts to delay. One can respect the policy trade-offs they have to make, but in this instance, the crossing of the 60% barrier in April 2021, the producing of uranium metal, the flirting with enrichment to 80% purity, the discovery of undeclared sites, these, and this is not a call for it, but this is a being historically cognizant. These are things that would have led to military action 1 or 2 decades ago. Now they're red lines that have gone pink, that are even forgotten about, that are merely technical capabilities that the regime has amassed, and we're supposed to sit there and live with it as other capabilities amass, like the missile program as well.
So I have 2 questions here, and I'm not sure what order they need to come in. Let's let's start with deterrent power. You wrote in your monograph that Iran's experiences during the Iran-Iraq war, people forget that Iran lost many, many, many people in the Iran-Iraq war, that one of the lessons was the imperative of deterrence and self-reliance. And Iranian officials claim that they have robbed their adversaries, including the United States, of the will to fight. You also noted that Iran was firing missiles at U.S. military bases with considerable accuracy 3 years ago. Just since October 17th, there have been more than 40 attacks on U.S. military bases in Iraq. 40 people have been injured. So the question is Iran right? Have we been deterred? If we're not, what should the payback be?
You know, I don't believe, I'm very glad you mentioned this. I don't believe the equation for deterrence is monocausal, meaning I don't believe one move, like one X move on the chessboard can cause Y, which is deterrence. And also, I'm sure you've had to deal with this debate in Washington, which is the way, unfortunately, we talk about deterrence in Washington is also quite poor. I have to say that with immense respect to a lot of not friends and colleagues, but a lot of people in the media space who talk about deterrence as a light switch, on or off, or it was absent, now it's restored, or it never existed, and then here it is all of a sudden. Deterrence, this magic, this magic word. That's not quite how the tool works in practice, how deterrence against an adversary works in practice. And let's I think it might be helpful, therefore, to unpack that. You know, by definition, a national security interest, something that you believe is an interest, is something that is, for lack of a better word, worth killing, fighting, and dying over. There's no way to say that in polite society, but that is essentially the definition of an interest, where it is so imperative to the national security of X country that it would not just justify, it necessitates the military tool to defend its lapse and to prevent it from lapsing as well. So you need to understand the relationship between a military tool or sacrificing the ultimate thing in defense of this. So whatever one puts on the bucket list of things that for national security purposes require military deterrence, we have to understand what that means in practice, which is the implementation of the military tool. Taking that a step further, you mentioned the war, which I'm very glad you mentioned. Too few people in Washington pay attention to that conflict. That war was the wellspring for essentially every problem we have with the Islamic Republic, minus the human rights issue and minus the hostage taking, which obviously happened essentially right after February 11, 1979, and then right after November 4, 1979. So within less than 1 year of the regime being in power, you saw massive human rights violations, massive women's rights violations, and the regime acting out and taking international hostages, U.S. diplomats hostage for 444 days. A lot of the other things that we face from the regime, the nuclear program, ballistic missiles, drones, international terrorism, energy security / insecurity, maritime threats to the freedom of navigation, the Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf, the desire to export or spread the Iranian Revolution. These are all things that happened during the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq war. Experiences, battlefield experiences, political experiences during this conflict led Iran to pursue those habits. And now they've kind of pursued those programs or those national security traits or threats on steroids. And they believe that once they were able to obtain pauses in warfighting from Saddam, responding what they call in kind. In Persian, they say muqabale bimist, responding in kind, combating in kind, ballistic missile for ballistic missile, Scud for Scud. Once they were able to change a political situation using a military tool, that turned on a light switch that has never been turned off, which is the use of violence for political purposes, the instrumental use of a military tool to achieve political aims. And you see that precisely straight line from the Iran-Iraq war to the October 7th. That's the passive one. This is the active one. This is the Iran-Iraq war. They're on the receiving end. They're trying to stop an attack. October 7th, they're trying to instigate an attack. Passive, active, passive, and active. Connecting that logic all the way through to the US force presence in the region, the Iranians tell you themselves, when the US left Afghanistan and the way it did in 2021, you had the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said, this is not the same America of 10 or 20 years ago. And the men at their helm today are not just the men who are veterans of the war or who remember the war. They are people who also have seen the last 10 to 15 years of how the Iranians, through this proxy network, has been able to contest America. And through the rise in missile power and the rise in this asymmetric and eventually a hybrid conventional Iranian military capability, plus this proxy network, plus the pursuit of a nuclear program, essentially almost at all costs, the regime believes that it has been able to create, for lack of a better word, facts on the ground and capabilities to respond to any kind of American military tool against it, such that as America, or even such that Israel, as a more responsible, as a more conventionally armed, outsized military power, would have to take those things into account. And like responsible military planners in Jerusalem and Washington would, they have taken those things into account. And that's precisely why the regime's evolution as a missile power and as a drone power and as a rocket power and what they're hoping for as a potentially threshold nuclear power is to alter the risk-reward calculation in the minds of politicians and security planners in Jerusalem and in Washington to absorb more than they respond, to react through a deployment rather than through an action, rather than through a strike. And if they strike, to strike away from Iranian territory rather than on Iranian territory. It is designed to get the adversary, who they know is more capable than them, who they know is more conventionally proficient than them, to pull punches, and then when they do, to very kind of narrowly employ the military tool. So unfortunately, I do believe America, and to some extent even Israel, has been deterred. It is precisely why there is no kind of even overt military action against Iran's proxies in Iraq. You know, we can use this as a discussion vector to get into what's been happening in the region, but President Biden has been more responding against empty Iranian weapons depots and storage facilities tied to militias in Syria, which is essentially a free fire zone, and not in Iraq, where there is a cost and there are militias and there is domestic politics to worry about in a place like Baghdad. So in essence, by creating more facts on the ground, by introducing new weapons, and by introducing this concept of political fragility, the Iranians have been able to foist the responsibility of what would happen after a strike onto an Israel, onto an America. And in essence, not only have they not been deterred all the way, but they've been able to effectuate deterrence in our thinking and in the thinking of the Israelis. And it's precisely why they feel so unconstrained about the use of force, because of the response ratio, be it either from Jerusalem or from Washington, being, with respect, so poor.
Okay, this leads us to another two thoughts. The first of which is the Iranians look like they are pretty good at this. They have created good missiles, good UAVs, good technologies, and good capabilities. But we've had sanctions on them forever. Does that mean that our sanctions regime and the UN sanctions regime, which I'm going to ask you about separately since it just disappeared, does that tell us that those sanction regimes are a waste of time? And the reason that's the first question is because the second question has to do with our responses. Even in your monograph, you talked about more sanction pressure, more export controls, disrupting procurement and proliferation, and increasing missile defense capabilities. Is this a waste of time? Are they already at a point where more sanctions won't matter because they've already got it?
It's an excellent question, and it gets again to that Washington thinking of, are things monadic, more sanction, less capability? Not always. What you want to have these tools, again, you're trying to erode the capabilities of a defense industrial base over time to either produce things at home, procure things from abroad, and then eventually to limit the proliferation of them to the near abroad. In essence, you're trying to materially, economically constrain an economy. While many of these sanctions remain on the books today, the active enforcement is an altogether different matter. And the heaviest of the heavy penalties really were only brought on board following different rounds of UN Security Council resolutions from 2006 to 2010. And the heaviest of the heavy American penalties came in 2010 to 2015, admittedly being watered down from 2013 to 2015, and then came back again 2018 to 2021, and then again have been permitted to atrophy. So it's not like sanctions have been totally linear, and it's not like they've flatlined. There have been significant ebbs and flows, which have created opportunities for illicit actors within these markets to exploit these loopholes in the sanctions architecture, the difference between de jure versus de facto, white hat versus black hat traders, as well as, of course, the Islamic Republic adapting to different levels of economic pressure over time. But I would just say more generally, sanctions are not designed to be the sole solution to any of these problems. These are, again, military problems, which may require at some point military tools. We have to be intellectually honest about that. But we need a strategy that contains informational, diplomatic, economic, military, and other tools. And on the economic front, I think this is the best way to think about it. The regime is intent on prioritizing guns over butter. We've seen that in practice for decades now. What sanctions can do and what more sanctions pressure could do, as well as we can talk about export controls in a second, because that would go after things that are dual use and commercial and limit the supply of things and teach jurisdictions that are transit hubs like UAE and Malaysia and Turkey and other places how to identify some of this problematic smuggling behavior, how to identify who is not actually the end user, who are the actual banks and businesses tied to the IRGC and the Ministry of Defense and its entire array of businesses that are active in the missile production and missile proliferation space. How to actually do that, export controls can be helpful. But think of sanctions, particularly the toughest of the tough sanctions that go after the resources and the industries. Think of them as essentially handcuffing or handicapping one of the Islamic Republic's two hands. This is a regime intent to be fighting, to be boxing, for lack of a better word, to be producing, procuring, proliferating these missiles. What the sanctions do is put one hand behind its back, right? And when one arm goes behind its back, the efficacy of the other hand drops. And when the efficacy drops, the duration of the fight grows, and you can begin to move the direction of the fight, of the battlefield, to continue to play with this analogy, towards you rather than towards the adversary or towards the regime. So sanctions create delays, they create choke points. You know, probably one hidden success of probably, if I had to say, covert and overt, covert, because there's only been one or two articles about it, talking about desires or even programs, one should say, that existed from the American intelligence community to prevent long-range strike capabilities from emerging in the Islamic Republic and to delay potentially an Iranian ICBM. There was talk of a potential of, foreign-assisted ICBM in Iran coming in 2012 or 2015 even. But there are reports that dating back to the Bush administration that said allegedly there have been attempts to introduce defective tools, defective products into a known illicit foreign supply chain that would help this program just to slow down that capability. And that would be something on the covert side. And then when you marry that with something on the overt side, like sanctions, together you can slow down this race, which the Islamic Republic is intent on running anyway. And this gets to a point of philosophy rather than policy, which is if the military tool is not politically viable, or it is a politically precocious time to use that tool, the other tools become more important, and you have to know what they give you. They don't solve the problem for you. They become tools of managing the crisis. And we have to understand the utility of these tools over time, the covert and the overt, and be able to calibrate them. And precisely what I see right now with the unenforcement of the sanctions is not only not a calibration, I see a dereliction of duty, where this one tool, which is not even the silver bullet, is being left to atrophy. So we can expect more, not less, unfortunately, developments in this space.
Worse than atrophy, I would suggest, because if you look at the Trump administration's ability to reduce Iran's foreign currency holdings, which was really quite successful, and the Biden administration's desire to put money back into Iran. You're not only not making the sanctions more effective, you're just eliminating them altogether, which also indicates then that the UN taking the ballistic missile sanctions off of Iran last week or 2 weeks ago was a really bad idea. And the US did not fight that either. And you have the introduction of China in a way that it hasn't been there before. So all of these things, you're talking about sanctions being not 100% the answer to the question, but a tool in a toolbox that will help. Except that we've basically thrown out the toolbox, haven't we? If you would talk about China, that would be.
That's a huge problem. And there's the foreign element, which is the Russia and China, as well as North Korea, as well as acknowledging the role of these three states in helping Iran with its missile and military programs, particularly in the rebuilding phase after the Iran-Iraq War in the 1990s. These three countries, beginning with North Korea, then China, then Russia, were essential in getting the Islamic Republic to rebuild and create that initial defense industrial base, as well as provide select munitions that allowed it to scale up over time. They were, for lack of a better word, present at creation, to borrow from the Dean Acheson memoir, about the history of the Iranian ballistic missile program. There was the illicit procurement from North Korea, attempted from Syria and from Libya during the Iran-Iraq War. And then there was that continuation after the war, once they recognized the political utility of this tool. And those three states' influence and impact cannot be minimized, particularly in that formative decade, the 1990s. Where I'm most worried about today is the reverse proliferation. There are things that Iran has that North Korea does not have. There are joint ventures that North Korea and Iran could go on to. There has been talk of, since the Obama administration, since the late Obama administration, Iranians in North Korea working on major rocket boosters that would be of immediate use for the regime's space program, which would be of use again for their pathway to a ICBM one day. Beyond that, of course, I would also say that the regime has been able to, for lack of a better word, brag about this newfound capability, of being a net exporter of missiles, such that Russia in the 1990s was present at creation, but today you have potentially Iranian close-range or short-range ballistic missiles slated to go to Russia. So the tables have turned from where they were about 2 or 2.5 decades ago. And this might be a good transition to the UN missile embargo, because there is good news and bad news there. First, the good news, which I do want to trumpet because it has been drowned out so much by the bad news. The good news is that despite, and again, unfortunately, one has to begin with bad news because there is so much of it, despite the Biden administration not doing anything to extend the missile sanctions, there was a cognizance of this evolving missile threat. Particularly, remember, we talked about one of those vectors being range. There is a cognizance in the minds of the Europeans at a time when 2.5 years ago, they mocked the Trump administration for trying to unilaterally extend a conventional arms ban against the Islamic Republic. And 2.5 years fast forward, European civilians and European critical infrastructure in Ukraine is being targeted by Iranian long-range strike systems, such as drones, for instance. That has turned on a light, coupled with the regime's nuclear escalation, coupled with the regime's flagrant violations of the JCPOA, and much more important agreements like the additional protocol and potentially even the non-proliferation treaty. That has turned on a light. Plus, of course, the 1 year of nationwide anti-regime protests we saw starting after the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini. This is all turned on a light in the minds of European policymakers about, well, if we can't stop the UN missile sanctions from expiring, or if we remain so wedded to the JCPOA that we don't want to collapse that architecture and bring back these older, more permanent UN-based prohibitions, which are supposed to be global in reach against the Islamic Republic, well, maybe we can defend our own sovereign non-proliferation sanctions. And the good news here is that actually on October 18th, per the text of the JCPOA, the Europeans had promised, and indeed were slated to, delist over 300 missile, military, and nuclear entities from their own sanctions list. This was part of what made the JCPOA such a Faustian bargain. When they shook hands in 2015, this is something that they had promised to do come 2023, come year 8 of the JCPOA. And we saw the US leave the deal in 2018, the Iranians more overtly begin to leave it in 2019, but the Europeans still remain wedded. Now with this decision, this retention of those 300 names, as well as the legal predicate for non-proliferation sanctions in Europe, because they were supposed to also wrap up the legislation that allowed some of these entities to be sanctioned to begin with the retention of that and the retention of these names, we now have an opportunity in Washington to bridge the transatlantic gap on ballistic missile sanctions in a way that we have slowly been able to do quietly on the drone sanctions, identifying gaps in European sanctions architecture, as well as on export controls, and then tightening them has been one of the quiet success stories, politically, legally, and diplomatically, between Washington and Brussels and Washington and London. But that is for a low and slow threat like drones. There is much more work to do on a high and fast threat like ballistic missiles. And the fact that the European Union has not issued non-proliferation sanctions since December 2012, since 11 months before the interim nuclear deal, since 11 months before the joint plan of action, means that there is a lot of work to do. So if Washington now desires, it can actually give all the targeting data, all the designation data it has had in its possession for Treasury Department sanctions against the whole run-of-the-mill of the missile, military, and nuclear entities it has hit since late 2012, early 2013, and build on that retention, on the retention of those 300 names. The Iranians fear this. The Iranian intent is always to play one side of the Atlantic against the other. And more importantly, this could get Europe in a prime position where if there is a change in Washington in 2024, to be able to actually go beyond retaining sanctions and actually adding sanctions. And again, allowing both sides of the Atlantic to sing from the same song sheet, to sing from the same notes on the Iran threat is going to be key to working against an adversary that is intent on keeping America's allies and partners apart. Just to bring it back home to what's going on in the region, when Iran sees American allies and partners coming together, they are afraid. One reason why I believe October 7 was green-lighted was because of the success of integrating Israel into the region. Israel in CENTCOM, Abraham Accords, more joint exercises, and most importantly, the talk of Israel potentially normalizing with Saudi Arabia. And that's when the Islamic Republic realized that they were being encircled, that they were being diplomatically isolated. So we can't let the Islamic Republic use, again, a tool of violence or a threat of violence to keep American partners and America itself from coordinating and talking with one another. And that's why I think, while unfortunately the UN sanctions were permitted to lapse, this retention of EU and UK sanctions does offer America a pale green light to bridge the gap on sanctions, to help enforce European sanctions, help Europe enforce its own sanctions, and to get targeting data in the hands of Europeans to see the missile threat the same way that they're seeing the drone threat, and to have America and Europe sing from the same sheet on the Iranian missile issue for the first time since 2012.
It would be nice, since we were off during the Trump administration and now we're off the other way during the Biden administration. So it would be nice. But again, I suspect, as you mentioned, the 2024 election, unless there is a change either in this administration's approach to Iran, and I don't see one, or a change in administrations altogether, it looks like we're still in a holding pattern. Only this time, the Europeans may be a little bit ahead of us. I don't know where that's going to go, but you brought this back to the region. One of the things that Iran has done is fill up Hezbollah's arsenal with various kinds of things and various kinds of capabilities. Why would be one question. So you don't see Hezbollah jumping to defend Hamas in Gaza, and you don't see them jumping into the war. First of all, is Iran keeping them out of the war? Or do they think they won't succeed? Or does Iran have other plans for the use of the Hezbollah arsenal? It seems to me they might.
Hezbollah is rightly, unfortunately, but rightly called the most successful export of the Islamic Republic's revolution. Also, when you look at it in the Levant, it's really the most capable in terms of military capabilities, the most capable Iranian proxy. It's not the oldest Iranian proxy, those are in Iraq, but it really in the Levant, on a country that's bordering Israel, it's certainly the most capable. And that's a scary thing, because after the 2006 war, and the buildup of the rocket arsenal. Remember, we talked about this spectrum of unmanned aerial threats. The buildup of the rocket arsenal. There was also a move to develop and traffic precision-guided munitions, PGMs, basically something that can take a rocket, which is unguided, and with the enhancement of the rocket, adding guidance and control technology and fins and some kind of computer equipment behind the warhead, but before the missile body, you could take a rocket and roughly, update it, improve it to make it a missile. And that's really the only difference. It's, a rocket and a missile. The main distinguishing feature between them is guidance and control. And that adds, just like the Islamic Republic has been able to add quality to a quantitative advantage, that adds quality to Hezbollah's quantitative advantage. You've heard Israeli security planners talk about, and unfortunately the number has gone up, of mortars, rockets, and PGMs. Obviously it's a much smaller scale of tool, the higher up on this number you go, but mortars, rockets, and PGMs ranging from 100,000 to 120,000 to 150,000 to almost 200,000. And the growth rates for each of these capabilities is qualitatively different, but nonetheless, all of these arsenals are growing. And the Islamic Republic is doing that. One, first and foremost, Occam's razor. One of the reasons they created these groups is to be able to put a knife more effectively against the neck of the Jewish state. You see quite effectively now with Hamas, when they say death to Israel, when the Islamic Republic says death to Israel, they mean it. There is this element about, Israel hatred, Jew hatred, which is orientating and animating for some of these folks. And it's the connective ideational tissue between them. But beyond that, the instrumental use of another population for a strategic aim, remember, violence to a political end, is to sharpen this tool against the neck of Israel and develop this ring of fire that they've created against Israel's borders by more effectively arming and equipping these proxies that it has been able to create in some places, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, or co-opt in some places, like Hamas in Gaza or the Houthis in Yemen. And through material support for these groups, be able to constrain and restrain Israel's political and military space and room for maneuver, and to raise the threat of a widening war, such that America, if it ever does have to come in, has to come in to restrain and constrain Israel, because again, it would play to the fear of a widening war, and that fear would be not okay to have in the eyes of a more responsible, external power like America. So again, Iran is able to raise the specter of a conflict spiraling out of control to get America to dampen a crisis. Think of what Kissinger did in '73 on steroids to get Israel to pull back. Sometimes you hear this phrase, Israel is not permitted to win a war. There is a reason, there is an effectiveness that the adversaries are able to play up, that if we are fully beaten, then that'll set the predicate for even something more major, and therefore you have to do ceasefires and deconfliction agreements, and that can lead to a different kind of political agreement and potentially in the future. There is a cognizance, there is an intellectual understanding, unfortunately, that the Islamic Republic has about how they can pit these groups against one another. And then finally, to talk about its own security and the lesson of the Iran-Iraq war, forward deployment, and more importantly, keeping a conflict away from Iranian territory. That's the definition of bringing a conflict as far away from Iranian territory as possible and potentially bringing it onto Israeli territory, such that if the Israelis ever do need to take military action overtly from their country, fly jets over the Middle East and strike at Iranian nuclear and military installations inside Iranian territory, that force which would deter them. And respectfully, I would say, thus far, the prospect of a major conflict has deterred them. I want to go out on a limb here, is that the Islamic Republic would be counting on precisely that arsenal. That arsenal that it has been refining in the hands of Lebanese Hezbollah was not built to bail out Hamas. It was built to prevent an attack on the regime's nuclear installations, which is the crown jewel. And think of it like different cards in a deck. the Hezbollah would be essentially the jack, and the crown jewel would be the king, would be the nuclear program. They have different functions. The jack is not there to bail out the five of spades. The five of spades is something they can conveniently roil up, animate, and deploy. And you see the real world effects of that after October 7, where even though Hamas doesn't have the capabilities Hezbollah has, as the Israelis begin to respond, there are other shorter range tools and even regular weapons of war, like anti-tank weapons, which will complicate the Israeli room for maneuver in North Gaza, much like anti-tank weapons in 2021 actually were shockingly successful, as well as the anti-tank weapons that Hezbollah is firing itself today, not at tanks, but at other fixed Israeli positions, be they civilian or military. So that major arsenal that the Islamic Republic has helped Hezbollah create is not there to be expended tomorrow. I think the relationship between patron and proxy here is much more nuanced than people understand. Traditionally, in the academic world, you have the theory of, forgive me, I'm forgetting the name of this theory. It's not a good moment to forget it. But you have the theory of where the patron and the proxy don't get along. In essence, a principal agent problem, it's called, where over time, the more powerful the agent, the greater the incentive to push back against the principal, and the leverage moves away from the principal and towards the agent. So in the world often talked about by a lot of academics who study this issue, if Iran gets on the phone tomorrow and says to Hezbollah, go for it, Hezbollah, the agent who is now empowered, can say, no, go shove it. That is one hole. The other hole, the very Washington hole, is the other end of the spectrum, which is that it's a patron-proxy relationship on steroids, and they snap to it, and he calls and picks up the phone, and before the phone even clicks, he's anticipated what he wants, and they're on the same page, and they go together, and they fire together. Both, I think, are caricatures. Both are extremes. What you have more likely is a loose command and control and an ideational and a strategic intonation about the nature of both of their missions, given that the connective tissue is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps between the regime and between Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah says, hey, I can't do this now, it's not that the regime would curse them out and put down the phone. The regime is more likely to say, why? What do you need? What can we get you? How much time does it require? This is what makes this alliance system that the Islamic Republic calls the axis of resistance so effective and, in fact, so scary, because of the responsiveness to local conditions, not the imposition of a foreign mission merely on local conditions. It's the marrying of that foreign strategic aim that the Islamic Republic has with local considerations. And you saw that with the Nasrallah speech. Thus far, Hezbollah hasn't stayed out, but it hasn't expended that most important arsenal. So that most important thing that Iran wants as a knife against the neck of the Israelis to deter the Israelis remains.
So that's what you have, actually. You have minor incursions by Hezbollah. You have minor shelling by Hezbollah, just enough to keep Israel on its northern border, and in fact, having to evacuate large numbers of citizens from the north, but not enough to force Israel to go into Lebanon and do anything about the problem. So they're calibrating, it seems to me, rather effectively.
Precisely.
Well, that's not very good. Now, speaking of calibrating effectively, is it possible that Hamas went too far this time, that they might not have been expecting the response to October 7th that they got, and that might be the reason that at the moment they're pushing for a ceasefire or a pause? Were they surprised by the Israeli response, do you think?
Well, I think rightly, and you've seen this discussion in the space, and perhaps more so acutely in the political space and the media space, rather than the military space or the analytical space. But you've heard this line, and I'm intent to agree with it because it gets to the issue of proportionality and the nature of the Israeli response, which is that I don't think they knew that it would be in this scale and in this scope, and that the Israelis would be willing to pick up not just a military burden, but also a political burden for what comes next, what comes after, how intolerable the situation of permitting Hamas to remain on your doorstep would be, which is as much of a complex political question as it is a military question. That I think Hamas did not understand. But more broadly, the bigger problem here, and that is Iran, you hear this phrase a lot, fighting to the last Arab. I think the Islamic Republic did anticipate a major military operation, but I think, and this gets again to the regime using military tools for political aims, wants a situation to come about where even if Israel wins the battle, it loses the war. And that is, again, the use of force to effectuate a political outcome that you want. And the political outcome being either bogging the IDF down and having eroding international and even potentially Israeli public support for the IDF's operations in Gaza, as well as transferring and overshadowing the nature of the fight to the need to respond to something so heinous that we all saw on October 7th to, well, what is going to be the state of 2.2 million Palestinians? What is the future of Gaza? What kind of political organization do you need there? What is the nature of Israeli targeting Gaza? Have all the tunnels been rooted out? What is the nature of this hospital? Is this a human shield? Is that a human shield? Having the debate platform switch. And I think, unfortunately, there, the Islamic Republic calculated correctly that October 7 would be overshadowed by these debates, and that the anticipation is, given the saliency of these debates in the West, that will translate to more political handcuffs on Israel. And what you're seeing with the new military component that the Islamic Republic has brought on board, which is the proxies in Syria and Iraq firing at US positions, and the Houthis just recently having downed an American drone, is to bring in other elements of the axis of resistance. They were not created to bail one another out, but having them be more integrated together and opening up another low-intensity front, not against Israel this time, but against America this time, to get America to be worried about precisely what you've seen it worried about so much, which is a widening war, an escalating war, and in essence have that play to America's risk aversion, and have that risk aversion play to American political pressure on Israel to suspend its operations, and therefore Iran, net effect, is able to strike at Israel. You had Iranian newspapers talking about the glory of Israel being removed, the Heymaneh of Israel being removed. You've had Iranian security planners and political officials talk about Heybat, that kind of awe-inspiring deterrence of Israel being destroyed by October 7. And you have this feeding into yet another cycle of violence that the Iranian government will use to justify a continuation of its death by 1,000 cuts strategy against Israel. So the goal is, yes, to find some way to save Hamas, but there is a willingness to fight even to the last Hamas member because of the cognizance of what the political situation will give them, which is the potential to reconstitute, perhaps not rearm overnight in the Gaza Strip, but the potential to reconstitute. And you see this willingness to move from the military to the political so quickly, given the regime really stepping up a diplomatic offensive, really coordinating with, still shockingly somehow, NATO ally Turkey, as well as Qatar, as well as Russia, about what to do, about trying to generate more international pressure on Israel to permit Hamas to live and fight another day, when precisely the goal of the Israeli military operation is to prevent that.
So, as an aside, I don't call Turkey a NATO ally anymore, but rather a NATO member. There's no mechanism in NATO to dump it out. Otherwise, I think we'd have dumped it out. So just my own personal belief is they shouldn't be called a NATO ally. They should just be called a NATO member. But that's an aside. To the main point, we have circled back here to the first point, which is America's role here and America's aversion to what should we call it? Concrete action or military action or fundamental action
yeah.
to end a threat, and rather America's willingness to let a threat continue to live as long as it doesn't bite too hard. And I think that's where the difference between the Israelis and the Americans has come out. Israelis said, look, we've had it. We're done. They went too far this time and we are done. The US has not had that experience yet. When we had it in 2001 on September 11th, we did what Israel did. We fought back. At the moment, we in Israel are not on the same page for that. And that's of concern. So this leads us to our last question, because we're going to run out of time soon. People who watch this program know that I like to end on a positive note. I like to have my last question be, one to which there is a positive response.
Huh.
I don't have very many positive questions these days. So let me just ask you outright, is there a silver lining here? Is there something that could come out of this that would work well for democratic countries, for allied countries, for people we want to win, and work out badly for people we want to lose?
I'm really reaching in here, but I think there is one, and
Okay.
it is worth amplifying, I have to say. When I mean reaching in, I mean not, manufacturing or artificially inflating. I mean reaching in because unfortunately it has not been part of the discussion since October 7, even though I think it is the elephant in the room, which is the willingness by some, whether it's Israel or America or the Europeans, to have a willingness to connect the dots on this issue. Not just how it happened, but why it happened, but why it was authorized in the way it was authorized, why it came about when it came about, and what, again, strategic purposes this grotesque these grotesque acts of violence served for a patron like the Islamic Republic of Iran that has made a habit out of supporting groups that act like this. And that means that all roads do lead back to Tehran. That means that you cannot have a successful, be it political or any other type of policy, pushback against Hamas unless you bring into account the financing and material support of its patron. You cannot deal with this multi-directional, multi-domain fire that Israel is facing until you talk about the actor that has put that broad spectrum of unmanned aerial threats in the hands of these different fighters across multiple jurisdictions of weak central authority and battlefields in the Middle East. You cannot have a Syria policy or a willingness to strike in Syria and a willingness not to strike in Iraq, given the ascendancy of Iran in one place versus not the other. You can't pretend that the Houthis in Yemen have not been able to strike over 1,000 kilometers away from their territory because of Iranian munitions that they have provided them with for several years now. So there is hopefully a willingness to connect the dots, to realize the need to hold Tehran accountable, but then also to listen to what is going on within Iran. And this is a point I want to make as an Iranian American. Since 2009, you've had the Iranian people chanting in different iterations of national uprising and protest, Na Ghaze, na Lebanon, Janam Fadai Iran, which translates to not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran. If we ever had a more responsible, a more secular, a more democratic, a more responsive to the views, values, and interests of the Iranian people, a different government in Iran that reflected those views, values, and interests, you could not have had a group like Hamas have the backing that it did, be it in any iteration of conflict it has had with Israel from when it took over the Gaza Strip up to and including after October 7. It simply could not have happened, given the fact that you would be removing the most important external backer from the chessboard. It doesn't mean that local dynamics don't exist. It doesn't mean that this still isn't an issue in the heartland of the Arab world. But you would be pulling out quite literally the rug from under the feet of this proxy group because you would be robbing it of a patron. So when I say all roads lead back to Tehran, it's not just about defanging the regime. It's about understanding that so long as we continue to try to placate the regime or buy time with the regime or curtail one threat from this regime or prioritize one threat at the expense of another threat, so long as we don't have a strategy that is geared to the existential threat that the regime faces the most, which is from inside, which is standing with the Iranian people, with supporting the people who hours after, and I mean this with no disrespect to Palestinian friends and acquaintances, but showing you the sign of the willingness of the Iranian people to go quite literally in the 180-degree opposite direction of the government, which has tried to shove the Palestinian issue down the throats of the Iranian population, who, again, as we've just mentioned, have been chanting against Iranian aid going to terror groups in that part of the world. You saw at a soccer game hours after what happened on October 7th. Some pro-IRGC, pro-Hamas folks try to wave a Palestinian flag at a soccer game, and you had those folks shouted down with expletives being chanted from Iranians in the thousands in that soccer field, in that soccer stadium, telling that individual who tried to wave the flag what to do with that flag. I mean this again with no disrespect, but it is to show how much of an issue this has become in Iran and how sharp the contrast is on every single issue between the state and society in Iran, and to take this into account. Policymakers in Washington and Jerusalem need to take this into account because this is a major untapped force in this space.
One of my favorite images is actually an Iranian woman who had come down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs is an Israeli flag. She is intended to walk on that flag. And the image is she jumps over the flag because she won't step on it. And I love that because that is the kind of image of where Iran can go under the right circumstances. So I'm happy that you ended with that. We, JPC, we Israel, support the Iranian people in their effort to have a government that represents them and represents them honestly. So if we move people in the direction of understanding that Iran's present government, the Mullah government, is the root of a lot of the evil in the region, maybe it's a step forward. I hope it's a step forward. And in the meantime, Behnam, thank you for a major, major enlightenment on something we're not focused on day to day, but we need to be. So thank you for your talent. Thank you for your skills at explaining. Thank you for a really amazing presentation.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.